Welcome back to Hot Flashes and Cool Topics. Today, I always say we have interesting conversations, but truly, this one we have not had before. And we are talking to Dr. Raymond Moody and Paul Perry, who are co-authors of Proof of Life, Afterlife, 7 Reasons to Believe There is an Afterlife. Now, I'm jumping in head first because I've had experiences myself, but I think a lot of people are skeptical about this and are like, I don't know if I would, enjoy reading this, or I would read it. Guys, if you can get a hold of a copy, go to the bookstore and read it, because it's fascinating. And there is so much research and hundreds of experiences that are documented that we just don't even know about. So welcome to the show, Raymond and Paul. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice
Thank
introduction.
you so much.
Thank you.
You were telling us beforehand how much time you put into creating this book. So do you mind, Paul, starting with that, and Raymond, just pop on in whenever you want to, talking about creating this
Okay,
book.
let me get into it, okay?
Sure.
Let's say 23 years ago, probably 23 years ago, we started talking about this category, which we'll get into later, called shared death experiences. And we had collected a number over the years, and in many of our books, we've had shared death experiences in the books. But we were sitting out on Raymond's porch one day, and I said, we were working on a book called Paranormal, which is a memoir of Raymond's life. And we ran into a bunch of shared death experiences that we'd written down over the years. And I said, let's just do a book on shared death experiences. And then the subject dropped. And then a few years later, Raymond was visiting me in Arizona. Raymond lived in Alabama at the time. And while he was visiting me, he then went to a conference, I believe, in Las Vegas. And his mother spoke to him and said that, she had a rash on her hand. She wasn't feeling so great. And I'll let Raymond explain that, but she passed away. And Raymond and his entire family experienced a shared death experience, which he'll explain in a minute. And at that point, from my side of the story, I wrote a proposal for this book. And like I said, this is probably 23 years ago, and passed it around to everybody we know in publishing, which is a considerable number of people. It was over 20 editors looked at this, and they didn't want it. And that's happened before, and the book has always been a huge bestseller. When everyone likes it, it's perfect timing. But everyone rejected it, and then they all rejected it again. We had our agent, Nat Sobel, send it out again several years later, and it went nowhere. And then one day I was in Sedona with my wife, and we were talking to, we share friends with the publishers of Beyond Word Publishing, which is a subsidiary of Simon & Schuster. And we were having breakfast with them, and I told them about this book, and they just said, I want it. How quickly can you get me a treatment? So I pulled out my iPhone and sent them the treatment right there. And they picked up this book. Then Simon & Schuster, who had rejected it at least twice, I don't think they remembered they even saw it. They got hot about the book. And that's where we are. We worked on this now for at least 2 years, but we overall had worked on it for 20 some years, collecting stories. And here we are with the final book, Life. But Raymond's story is extremely interesting. So I wish he would, because it kind of intersects the story that I just told.
Right. Well, when I wrote Life After Life, I wrote it in 1974. It was published in 1975, my first book on near-death experiences. At that time, I knew from one case from my own wonderful professor of psychiatry, Martha McCraney was her name, that Martha had had all of these symptoms or signs of a near-death experience, getting out of the body, seeing this light in the tunnel, seeing her mother pass away into this light. Not when she was ill herself, but when she was resuscitating her own mother. So even when I wrote Life After Life, I knew that this thing would sometimes, at least once, leak out to the bystanders. But that was the first case. But I was doing my psychiatry residency. There was only so much time I could put into this research. So in the late 80s and early 90s, I began to just focus more interest on these cases of people who were there at the bedside, who had these things that otherwise we would call a near-death experience. That people would say that they would, as grandma died, they're in the bed, that they would leave their own bodies and go part way toward this light with grandma, or people would see apparitions of the dying person's dead relatives come into the room. The room would fill with a light. And incredibly, this is the most mind-boggling part of all of it to me, is that there are apparently quite a respectable number of people who, when somebody else is dying, that the bystander will empathically co-live the dying life review of the person who's passing away, including this panoramic vision in which they see the person's life. And so I was putting this together, and actually it was in 1994, Paul. I remember I went to that conference out in Las Vegas, but before that, you and I had been to some place where I just asked how many people in this room, you remember, have had one of these shared experiences, and there were a lot. So we were talking about it for some time. And then in June of 94, my mother died. And we were there in the room, and I had this experience. I mean, it's like when something that happens like that to you personally, I was baffled. I mean, it really changed the way I thought about things. But there was a some year hiatus there where I was just more trying to integrate my own experience rather than listen to a lot of people who had them. But then did it again, and then Paul did it, and I did publish that book on shared death experiences. And this thing we're working on now, it's even wider. It's we bring in all of these other astonishing experiences that happen when people are on their deathbeds, including, for example, numerous cases of people who, as far as their family knew, never had any interest in poetry or music while they were alive, will suddenly, on their deathbed, start reciting poetry, sometimes making up poetry on the spot, and sometimes singing. I mean, there's cases of people who actually sing their way out. And so, I mean, this is an astonishing array of things that go on in the dying process, which the general public doesn't really know about. And sociologically right now, it seems to me, at least by my own observation, there are flocks of people in that middle age period, 50s, late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, who are, had spent their life in a workaday occupation and focused on work. And now, as a natural phase of psychological life development in midlife, interest in this starts perking up. And also, I think, sadly, all the literally more than a million people who died from the COVID epidemic. And then you think of all that grief there among the loved ones left behind. I mean, it looks to me like there's an upsurge of interest in this sort of thing that's building almost to a tidal wave. It happens ever so often. This is cyclic. People get interested in this subject.
this is what happened with Raymond with near-death experiences. Is no, many people had experienced them. Many people had experienced them, but they didn't know what they were. And so when Raymond named and defined them, all of a sudden people start saying, "I've had that happen," and they sort of came out of the closet about their near-death experience and started talking freely about it. That's going to happen with shared death experiences. For example, what he was just talking about there was earlier was people, as they're dying, they start reciting poetry or singing songs beautifully, and they had never sang in their life. That's a form of a shared death experience called terminal lucidity. And it's when people who are on their deathbed suddenly pop out of death mode, and they start talking coherently about family business or about their love of the people around their bed, or telling the people they want a milkshake, or in some cases, they actually start to recite or write in their heads poetry or music.
Could we kind of get into the 7 reasons? Because the book talks about 7 reasons to believe there is life after life. And the first one we do talk is out-of-body experiences. And you share some great stories in the book about out-of-body experiences. And, you know, for a lot of people, they go, oh, the person was just dreaming, or, you know, their subconscious was, you know, sharing stories. But you share stories in the book about people who actually leave their body, go see someone, can tell you what they're wearing, or in one person's sad case, what their brother-in-law was saying, how he was going to be stuck at a funeral instead of going. So can you talk about the first element, which is out-of-body experiences, Paul, and kind of why is that such a clear indication that there's life after life?
Okay. Many people, I'm going to say at least a third of the people who have near-death experiences have out-of-body experiences. Is that right, Raymond?
Well, it's a high percentage, absolutely.
Let's say a third.
Yeah.
I think you said like 35% in the book.
Yeah, okay. That was a good memory on my part. Raymond remembers everything. I remember nothing. But oftentimes people who have out-of-body experiences have the sensation of leaving their body. All right. And at this point, in all the years that we've looked at this, I do believe that they are leaving their body, but they have no objective proof of it. So their subjective proof is that, hey, I felt like I was leaving my body. I was zooming away, and I know I left my body, but they don't have any objective proof, only subjective. So what we did with this book is based on objective proof of these various experiences. So when you get to out-of-body experiences, objective proof generally involves someone who leaves their body and is then able to go someplace else, or look down at an operating table if they're in surgery, and they're able to describe certain things that they should not be able to describe. And the one that you mentioned was Vi Horton, who's one of Raymond's oldest friends. She had a out-of-body experience, and I forget what she was in for. Was it gallbladder?
She had a gallbladder surgery, and she had a cardiac arrest during that surgery, which lasted for 40 minutes, according to her doctor, who told me this direct.
So during that period of time, she left the operating room and she went into the waiting room. And that's when she saw her daughters. Her daughters came in. They came in from, I think, from school. And they were both dressed in like mismatched plaids. So she reported having seen that. Her brother-in-law was on the phone, and he was dressed for golf, I believe. And he was talking to a friend who was supposed to meet him for golf. And he said, I'm not going to be able to play golf today. It looks like Vi is going to kick the bucket. And then she went on to see other things that she was able to report. And that made it all an objective shared death experience, because she was able to report things that had actually taken place during the period of her unconsciousness.
Yeah, that was those stories are amazing because the research, I know the research that you all have done. And I mean, the doctor that dropped the instrument during the surgery for one of the women he was working on, and the man that went out and told his wife to get in there and tell him I'm not dead. And
Oh, that was a wonderful story.
that was
Yeah.
that was amazing. And I kind of, going back to, you talked about the music. My mother passed away in 2013. There's 12 kids in my family. I'm number 11. And so
Wow.
numbers, what, 3 and 4 were at her home. It was the middle of the night. We knew it was going to happen sometime. And one of the sisters was downstairs with her in another room. My sister upstairs heard singing around 5 in the morning. She thought it was my other sister singing. She was like, "Why is she singing?"
Hmm.
And she went downstairs and my mother was gone. My other sister that was downstairs did not hear the singing, but the sister upstairs heard the singing.
Hmm.
So it is, part of me was like, why would she hear that at that time? And, I kind of thought something was going on anyway. I really did. I think maybe she heard something. She got a signal. But then I've read your book and I'm like, oh my goodness, the music part of it. And my mother wasn't a singer. So I don't know if it was my mother singing or if it was just music. I don't know what it was. But that it all relates to that.
And you bring up kind of an interesting feature on these and other paranormal experiences, is that sometimes you'll have a whole crowd of people in the room, there's other cases where you would be experiencing a metaphysical experience in a crowd too. But let's say you might have a crowd of people, and some of them don't, in this case, wouldn't hear the music, and some of them would hear it as clear as a bell. And that's something I've never understood, Raymond, but I run into it a lot.
Likewise,
So,
I'm baffled by that too. And I'm baffled by what many physicians over the years have told me, of being utterly astonished that their patients who were in a state of cardiac arrest could subsequently report accurately what they, when the operating room or whatever. So,
mhm.
and even when these things happen to you directly, it's very hard to compute them. I mean,
Sure.
these are very difficult things to understand by the rational methods we employ, and yet they do happen.
Well, Colleen, I want to hear about your near-death experience if you
Oh,
don't mind
well,
sharing.
Hey,
If you don't
yeah.
mind sharing it, because
no,
I don't
I
know if
mean,
I've heard it.
mine aren't like what they're saying, but when I was sick with my daughter after delivery, and they told my husband I probably wouldn't make it through the night, which luckily he didn't tell me. I was kind of semi-conscious, but I had an incredible sense of peace. And I remember reading in a book a long time before that about a story of a woman who died at the end of the book, and she was on a boat and she just felt like she was floating downstream in a very peaceful way. And that's the only thing I can liken it to, is that I was not nervous, I was not anxious, I was just incredibly calm and peaceful. And it was really like 2 days before I really kind of came out of what I was going through. And it just was so weird, because you would think you'd be in total panic because I was hemorrhaging out. And I just had this incredible sense of peace. And then when my father passed away, um, I do meditation. And I remember meditating and all of a sudden being in my family room of where I grew up, and my father sitting where he always sat and had a legal pad in front of him, which he always had. And he couldn't speak, but he was writing things like, "I miss you," and "I hope you're okay," and things like that. So I tend to notice the energy. Um, I tend to notice the energy around a dying person, or energy that leaves the body. So I'm a strong believer in it. But I would say, one of the things I'm curious about, Paul, is like the third thing you guys talk about, which is the transforming light. I never saw a light. That I can't say I
Yeah.
ever saw a light. But can you talk about, because so many people say, "Oh, don't go to the light. You're going to go to the light." What is it that people see? You know what I mean? They always say, "Don't go to the light." what do people see
Well,
as far
they
as
always
this
say don't
light?
go to the light because that's where they want to go.
Right.
Well, that's a great aspect of that, because some people just see a bright light that has substance,
Yeah.
and they don't know what it is, but it's comforting. They'll say that it contains. Sometimes it has a form to it, but they can't tell if that form is God or Muhammad or what. But they'll call it what they think it is. So you get a lot of people who see the light and they see Jesus, or they'll see dead relatives that they were always comfortable with, or other religious figures. For the most, they say that they acquire. Many say they acquire all the knowledge in the world, but when they come out of their near-death experience, they've forgotten most of it, and they're very frustrated as a result of having forgotten it. It's transformative. It's called transformative for a number of reasons. One is that the people who have had a bright light during their near-death experience tend to be the most changed. In a study that I worked on with Melvin Morris called the Transformation Study, we looked at people who had had near-death experiences, and the people who had seen light were people who had type A without the anxiety, is really what they came out to be. Is that they had a real desire to achieve knowledge, but weren't uptight about it. They were type A, they were in love with life, as opposed to the old type A, which wasn't necessarily in love with life, but was interested in getting it done, whatever it was. Melvin also did studies on children and near-death experiences. And he found that the most transformative aspect of it with children was the bright light, and that children would be transformed well into their adulthood after seeing the bright light during their near-death experience. That's true of adults as well who have near-death experiences, is that the bright light is very transforming. And once again, it turns them into type A without the anger, is essentially what it is.
Wow.
So that's the basis for the transform light. Raymond has some additions, I'm sure.
Well, you know what we hear too, Paul, as you know, is people talk about a sense of urgency, which is what you're describing. That's a phrase they often use. And, you know, I've spent my life pursuing knowledge. Get this, I had 2 doctoral degrees, a PhD in philosophy and an MD degree, plus 3 years of being a college professor before I was 31 old.
No
And
bragging allowed, okay?
well, but everybody listening to this knows
Okay.
that
Yeah.
had to be something very wrong with somebody like that.
Yeah.
Isn't that true? You know,
Maybe, but if you have a real thirst for knowledge, is different.
Right. That's what I thought.
Well,
You just
I
crave
do,
knowledge.
but it was,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
it was like, you know, I heard Goldie Hawn say something one time that was so brilliant. She had 7 years of psychoanalysis.
Hmm.
And she said, what psychoanalysis did for me, it changed me from a driven person to a driving person. And that's kind of the experience I had, that I was driven. I mean, why in the world did I think I had to get 2 doctoral degrees before I was 30? I mean, it was a mental sickness. In addition to the good part of it, which was the pursuit of knowledge. But I am very impressed in many of these cases where George Ritchie, the finest person I ever knew, and the first living person I ever heard this from, was a professor of psychiatry at UVA. And George said that at times, and I've heard this from many people, it's just George's experience in my life, and my life was so important, but he said he saw this panorama of everything you'd ever done. It was timeless. He was seeing it all at once.
Mm-hmm.
And he said this being he was with, this being of light that he identified as Christ. And he said when there were panels or parts of this hologram, whatever it is, that George was learning something, that this being would kind of slow down and focus in on it. And he said there's no words, but that the effect was that the thought came. That's very interesting. That even after you come over here permanently, this process of knowledge goes on. And George and many others have said that, as I gather, they say that this process of knowledge goes on literally for eternity. That's what people say.
That is, all of that is so amazing. When you talk about the panorama, and then there's going to be parts of your life that maybe you feel like you didn't do something very nice. Yeah. And
Yeah,
I'm hoping to
That's another
recuse
story.
myself from
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and you all address that at the end of the book too, talking about, well, what do you want to do to make sure it's there? But I want to go back to, and I may not be pronouncing this correctly, so please help me with it. The psycho mantium.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. That sounds so fascinating. And I'm reading at the back because you even give instructions on maybe how to make your room, make that in there.
Yeah.
The gazing and trying to
Can you talk about what it
Yeah.
is, and because it is fascinating.
When Raymond came up with this idea, I thought he had gone mad, frankly. And it was just so, and then he just kept developing it and developing it. And it greater and crazier until it didn't.
Yeah, this is, the funniest thing is that this is built into Western civilization. I found out about it when I was 18 years old, reading the Greek historian Herodotus, who talks about this oracle of the dead. And I had also known about it from the Greek playwright Aristophanes, who was a comedian. He kind of made fun of it. And so, but it was just a part of Greek society. They had these places where you could go and you would go through procedures during which you would seem to see and converse with departed loved ones. And this was just part and parcel of being Greek. It was not anything regarded as exceptional. Well, I remember reading that in Herodotus at age 18 and thinking, well, he had to have a bad day. I mean, it couldn't be. But to make a long story short, in the mid-'80s, I read an archaeological report on the most famous oracles of the dead, the very one that Herodotus mentions. And they had found in there, what they found was an enormous bronze cauldron that was in a subterranean chamber that was lit by torchlight. And immediately I realized what they were doing, because I knew that even there's a great history behind all this, but many people over many civilizations for thousands of years have discovered that when you have an optical clear depth, in the Middle East today, for example, they use a silver bowl. Okay, you highly polish it on the inside. You fill it with olive oil. Okay, and then by candlelight, and often there's an incantation, like nonsense words that come with it in the ancient recipes, like just magical nonsense words. And in these circumstances, the fact is, incredible as it may seem, that people who go through this after preparation actually do have experiences in a waking state of consciousness, which they interpret to be a visitation with a departed loved one. It sounds so astonishing in 21st century America. It was common knowledge in 19th century America, when people had instead of TV or radio, they had parlor games, right? So people knew you could set up a mirror by candlelight, you could call up grandma, or it was just part of the folk culture. And it's been repeatedly rediscovered by people through centuries. But So as Paul was saying, after I read this report, I had to try it out. And so I did, and I set it up. And I was thinking if I did, say, 50 cases, I would get 5 people who would have an experience, and then I could write a paper. But my initial subjects, they were psychology graduate students. Some of them were already counselors. They were just coming back for further education or whatever. Mature folks who knew about the mind. So with that setup, I thought, well, if any of these people have an experience, they'll say, well, yeah, I saw an image in the mirror. It looked like my grandma. Was it real or was it a figment? I don't know. But that's rather what happened instead, that it's more like 60% of the people who try it on the first attempt have some sort of experience which they interpret to be a visitation from, and even years people recount this as though it was an important event of their lives. And this happens all the time without a mirror too. It's a common thing that people have visitations or apparitions of their departed loved ones. But this is a way that's been known literally since antiquity, where you can facilitate that. You can
Wow.
bring it about in a sort of planned manner rather than just waiting for it to happen.
Sometimes, as he said, it didn't require a mirror. Although people would come in and they would try it with the mirror, they were unable to contact the person they wanted to contact. But later, with some of the cases, they would go back to the hotel and they would go to bed, and then the person would appear to them.
Yeah.
And they would have vivid, palpable conversations with these people, meaning that in one case, a woman came to see her son who had died from AIDS. She was unable to do that in the psychomantium, but back at the hotel room, he came into the room. They spoke like we're speaking right now. And I believe she said, "How do I know you're really here?" And he picked her up and hugged her.
Yeah.
Gosh,
Yeah,
wow.
And that's not the only
it's-
case like that. There's other cases
Yeah.
like that as well.
And it sounds incredible, but all you need to do is to set it up for yourself and see.
Try.
You
That's
know,
my
it's-
that's one I
Okay,
would love to
Bridget.
do. I'm like,
We're
this
doing it.
podcast room is a closet. I
Oh,
mean,
this is a
Right.
great psychomantium.
yeah, I mean, I'm
We're
like, I
doing
could,
it,
I could put
Bridget.
the light, but because both of my parents have passed. There is, here, I'm sorry, I'm turning this into a personal story,
I was
but
gonna say, where are we
I
going with
do-
this one?
I know. When I was 10 years old, I took dance lessons next to my church. And I was Catholic, had to go to mass on a holy night, walked over in my tap shoes with my heels up like this kind of, so I wouldn't make noise. And I didn't sit with my family because I was going to have to leave. And I looked over and there was a woman that was standing there. And I don't remember my grandmother. I was 11 months old when she died. And I kept thinking, this woman looks like a picture of my grandmother. And I kept looking, and then I go to communion and leave, like you're not supposed to, but I did. So I leave to go back to dance class, and the woman followed me out, and I held the door for her, and she took it, and then I turned around and she was gone. And I didn't think anything, went home that weekend. My dad came home for lunch, all these kids, he'd hold the newspaper up, read the newspaper, could totally tune us out. And I just am sitting there. I said, "Well, I saw Grandma in church the other day, and his newspaper went down." And he went, "You saw my mother?" And I said, "Yeah, I saw her in church." And it was All Saints Day. And he said she saw his brother who had died in World War II on All Saints Day.
Wow.
Like, well, probably how many years, 30, 40 years before that, on the same day. So I used to try to go back, never ever saw anything else ever again. I did not know that story about her seeing her son who was killed in World War II. But I saw her. So I'm like, I'm like, well, I'm going to come back and see one of you, I don't say, and I don't even go to
30
church
years.
anymore, but I mean, it just things like that happen,
That's
Can
right.
I ask?
The older people get, the greater percentage of your life mates or the people around you will had some experience during their lifetime.
Yeah.
stepping across.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
And once again, it's one of those things, if you start talking about it, other people say, well,
Other
that
people, yeah.
happened as well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then pretty soon the numbers grow. It's like with near-death experiences. It goes 15 million people who have had them to 18, 20 million people now. And that's just because they can define what it is and they aren't afraid to talk about it.
Can we talk a little bit about, you talk in the book, consciousness and soul? Because if you try to take the religious aspect out of the conversation, because everybody's going to think it differently. Like you said, someone's going to see it as God, someone's going to see it as, a million different religious figures. But what is our consciousness and the soul the same thing, or are they different? Paul, you start and then we'll jump
see
in.
them as interchangeable. I see the words as being interchangeable. How about you, Raymond?
well, in philosophy, the problem of personal identity is a big problem. And what is it that constitutes our self, our personal identity? Plato sort of got the ball rolling. It's the immortal, immaterial soul. Okay. That did pretty well up until the 1500s, because you could have gone to the stake for contradicting that, right? But in the 1500s, where things loosened up, Thomas Hobbes, it doesn't make any sense to talk in immaterial. I mean, what are we talking about in the first place? John Locke, who was kind of a non-American founder of our Constitution, tried to solve the problem, and he said, well, our self consists of our consciousness and our memories. But the great skeptic David Hume said, well, when I look at myself, I see only the impression of the moment. I don't see any lasting thing. And a lot of modern psychologists have sort of given up on the concept. But if you're asking where I come out on this, and a lot of people my age do, when I spent a year as a geriatric psychiatrist talking to really, eloquent and accomplished older people who were there for situational stress or loneliness mostly. But I heard constantly during that year, Raymond, the older I get, when I look back at my life, I think it's been a play or a movie, a drama, a novel, a story. And I think consciousness itself is narrative driven. And that, you could say that this is a kind of theater, right? We live stories, which is apparently the part of the Hindu faith is. And I think, I think the theater itself, which was invented by people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, I think that it came from this realization that people have as they get older, that life is a story. And they said, we can just make a flat place here and act out these. That's one of the most amazing things about the movies to me. You can go through into that movie and, a 70-year life will unfold, but it's just like you're out in 2 hours. So I think, it's where I think is what our consciousness is narrative. It's like you are the story you're going through, and everything whenever anything new happens to you, what do? You weave it into your life story.
Yeah. And it's the breaks in narrative that get a lot of attention because they're so puzzling. This is not a normal, usual narrative to have death experience.
That's right. It's like a little, I think in common sense, we imagine this impermeable, unpassable wall between this life and the next life. But the older you get, you see, to the contrary, it's for many people, over the years, I've known quite a number of people who had multiple near-death experiences over a period of years, most commonly because they had some cardiac problem was the usual reason.
Yeah.
And maybe he went to the other side and came back 3 times or so in their life. Or all the millions of people who say, yeah, grandma came and visited me last night. Those are just normal human experiences if you ask So what they indicate is that it's not exactly a impervious wall between here and there, that it's kind of more like a in and out scenario.
Yeah, and the big thing, that throughout your book was how people want proof of something. Everybody wants proof.
Right.
And but the way that you all went about collecting the stories and doing the research, did that, it provides proof. It just, when we're going back to just the stories from people, what they saw that could not be explained, that they could have seen this, and just the things that were said that could not be explained in any other way. And for me personally, my hope, I want to be able to experience being around my parents again. And I think you acknowledge that too in the book, is that some of this gives people some hope, especially after they're grieving an immediate grief thing. Yeah, it just, and I think that's where you also talk about how people who will come up, different people will research and say, oh, they just, something happened physically with them and that's why they saw this. Well, then
Right.
that brings those people back into grief again.
Yeah, but then if
You
you
know,
look at it, if you then turn to these people and say, well, how about the other 10, 20, 30 million people who've had the same experience? Because
right.
as Raymond taught us all, that there's there's type of experiences that come with the whole ball of wax known as a near-death experience. And you're not likely to have 20 million people having the same experience unless there's something to it.
And
And
it's
that's what
interesting. In the book, you describe the 14 common traits of a near-death experience, which we've talked about
Right.
most of them here. And I thought one of the really interesting things was when you were talking about the five senses are still there when you have an out-of-body
Right.
experience, because a lot of people will say hearing is the last sense to go. So talk to the person, let them hear you. But
Right.
you're saying like all five senses are
Well,
still.
what they say is that your senses
Yeah.
are amplified in a whole. People say, I have to say that I saw it because I saw it was like a visual experience, but it was not like vision we have here. For example, people who are blind in this life
Oh,
will
right.
say that when they have those experiences, they see, they have this other sense. And incredibly, I hear people all the time saying that there's like a telescopic zoom effect to it. That it's when you're over here and you want to see something over there, it's just like zoom, you're right in on it.
Right.
And yeah, and people also say that they see colors that don't exist.
Yeah,
in
which is a
our
very difficult, because then when you ask them, well, what is it? They can't, it's one of those things they can't describe. They can't describe, which
If
is
you
very frustrating because they end up going home with crayons and things. And
Trying to mix it up.
mix the
Yeah, that
colors,
would
make
be
like a
an
an
rainbow.
afterlife crayon bomb.
Afterlife crayon. There's our $1 million
Crayola.
right
There
there.
you go,
Yes.
Crayola. Are you listening? If you guys had to pick maybe one of your favorite stories that really showed you, wow, I'm on the right track here. I believe in this. This is really showing me that there is an afterlife. Can I ask, Paul, you start, and then Dr. Moody, you either one of you really. I would love to know if there's a story that stands out to you.
Well, there's so many, and I'm not going to say there's so many, I can't tell you which is the best, because I can tell you some of the ones that I think are the best. But the one that I would like to talk about is the one that happened to myself. And it was not a near-death experience, but it was an experience, a form of shared death experiences. And that is that I believe my mother died in 1994. She may have died earlier than that. But as she was dying, I was contacted by a friend who was the head of neuropharmacology, University of Washington, Vernon Neppy. And Vernon Neppy, in addition to being, the ordinary genius, he also studied a lot in paranormal experience, and he was working on a big body of research on deja vu. And he and I planned to write a book about deja vu, and it just never got off the ground. So I hadn't spoken to Vernon for at least 5 years. I hadn't even really thought of him very much. And on the day that my mother died, I got a call from him. And he said, I was sitting here reading the newspaper, and a voice came to me that said, call Paul Perry. And I ignored it. And about an hour later, I'd gotten to the sports section, and the voice again said, call Paul Perry. So I'm calling you, and I don't know why. But this is an MD, PhD. So, like you, he's someone to be reckoned with. And I said, well, that's funny. My mother's dying right now. She has dementia. And I just don't know if there's anything we can do about it. And he said, well, there is. And then he told me things that he had done, some experimental things he had done with some patients, including ECT, where they do the electroshock therapy. And that had kind of wiped her brain clean, and then she was able to start over again. I've never heard this one before. And he's saying, but you could try that, you could try this, you could try this medication. And meanwhile, the phone is beeping, telling me that there's someone else on the line. So I said, Vernon, I'll call you right back. I've got to answer this. And it was the care facility saying that my mother had just died. Now, I consider that a shared death experience. It seems to be too big a coincidence to be just coincidence. And yeah, I was really surprised that it happened, for all those reasons. And because when it happened, and his advice was, a little late, but good. And he had had a direct communication with somebody who said to call me. I don't know why that would happen, but it did. And I found it quite astounding.
What about you,
No,
Dr.
I feel like,
Moody?
yeah,
Oh, I just wanted to hear, is there a story that
That's
sticks
fine.
out to you?
Yeah, well, like Paul said, I mean, I've talked to thousands of people. They are all interesting, right? But the one that sticks out to me, not so much for the content of it, because that's been in all, thousands of others, but rather the personal connection. And that was the Dr. George Ritchie was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia when I was an undergraduate philosophy student. And he is from Richmond, Virginia. And my mother and father are from Porterdale, Georgia. Okay. And George's experience took place December 24th, I believe it was, in 1943, when he was an Army recruit who was found dead in the bed for double lobar pneumonia. Dr. Francie, the physician, said, this is the most amazing thing he's been involved with in 40 years of medicine, he said. And so George was apparently dead, but it's, to make a long story short, the ward boy who found him had never seen anybody his age die. So he just talked this ward boy into, the ward boy talked the doctor into injecting adrenaline into George's heart. And he came back with this amazing story of us. Now, I heard that in 1965 when it just changed my life instantly, because he was just such an amazing character. Years later, in 1976, my dad heard a tape of George Ritchie's experience and said, oh, December 1943, Camp Berkeley, Texas. He said, I was there, and so were you. And my mother and father had moved there early September, so that my dad could go to officers candidate school. I was conceived in late September. George's experience December 24th. My mom and dad moved away from Camp Berkeley on December 29th. So I was there in utero when this thing happened to me. But George was just an astonishing human being. He was he was just the most amazing person I ever knew. And his experience has played out in many people's lives, including mine.
Yeah.
It was just amazing. This woman in Richmond, who's very prominent, well-known person, told us that, she said, George was all into youth work, and he was a camp counselor, and he was an Eagle Scout himself, so he was always into scouting. So this woman, I believe she's an attorney, said when she was 12 years old, she was at camp and sitting on the screened-in porch, and she was like one of the staff there, and he came up, why are you sitting here on the porch? She doesn't like to do it. She said, well, I'm terrified of snakes. And she said to multiple people, she said, this happened. George said, come on with me. He took her out into the woods and he called up the snakes.
What?
Yeah. And she said, and I'm never again been afraid of snakes. But there was another woman who I knew told me that George came over to her house one night and her husband was dead. And so, um, and by the way, this is not made up stuff. And so she said, George, make him come back. And I can't do anything. Ethel or whatever her name was, she's dead. And George said, right at that moment, he heard the Lord, he said, say, wake him up. So George said, get up. And the guy did and lived some time after that. But, if you knew George and lived in the town where he lived, as I did, you just heard this kind of stuff from people all the time. And yet, he was not a saint. He was an incredible, but his experience is very similar to, it's like all the other, they do have these patterns to them. Yeah.
That is that story in your book, how the board boy went twice, didn't he?
Right.
Like twice, insisting for them to inject him and to do something about him. It's so now this is just me and what I want. I really wish, I don't know if you have anything about, I wish I could have known my great grandparents and ancestors. Do you know of any way that can happen, or if you could, I don't know if there's a way.
Are we doing a seance right now, Bridget?
I don't know, but I do. Wouldn't it be great? I mean, I would just love to know more about that.
We did write a book called Coming Back, and it was I guess it was the second book we wrote together. And it was about past life regressions. And that's one way you could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, there you go, Bridget. You got to go grab that book.
I am.
One thing I know, in one of the psychomantia cases I did was a young psychology graduate student.
Oh, yeah, that was great.
And she came intending to see her mother, I think it was. And her mother came, but along with them were other of her relatives, including her great-grandmother, who she had never known, who had died before she was born. But I will go on to say that this young woman said that it makes sense because this great-grandmother was like a family legend, right? That everybody always talked about what an amazing character she was. But she said, that she did see her great-grandmother who had died before she was born.
Okay, so there's a chance, Bridget.
Yeah.
So,
one thing I should solidify that a little bit is that in many of the psychomantian cases, you go to see one person and you end up seeing someone else. Oftentimes someone else in your family, and they may be actually distant. They might be grandparents and beyond. Am I correct? There's somewhere people
and also people say that it's when that happens, when they see somebody else in addition to or rather than the person they set out to see. A very common statement is that upon reflection, they realized that the person they wished to see was different from the person they needed to see. And that it seems to act more on who you need to see rather than who you would necessarily wish to see.
Yeah.
Well, we want to thank you both for coming on today. This has been incredibly interesting. And we suggest everybody go out and get Proof of Life, Afterlife, 7 Reasons to Believe There Is an Afterlife. Paul and Raymond, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see the book right there.
Yes.
Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the folks listening in too. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for this.
Thanks a lot. And